On the dark web, warnings repeatedly surface about a quiet South Korean settlement called Songmae Village. The rule is simple. After 1:13 a.m., you must not fall asleep. 30-year-old American documentary filmmaker Daniel Reeves received this warning directly. At exactly 1:13 a.m., an anonymous, encrypted email arrived in his inbox containing a single sentence, "Come before they erase what still remembers," and a highly disturbing video file of a sleepwalking villager. This map breaks down the metadata embedded in that video. The file's timestamp didn't match the current calendar. It was stamped with a future date, a full month ahead. The technical impossibility convinced Daniel he wasn't looking at a viral hoax. 3 weeks later, Daniel traveled to the mountains of South Korea. His local taxi driver drove him most of the way, but refused to take the final mountain road to Songmae. The driver warned Daniel that people leave before dark, and to listen if locals said to stay awake. Daniel laughed off the superstition. Trusting digital metadata over a local resident's very real fear, he walked completely alone into a physical environment where the danger would soon become impossible to escape. Arriving by evening, Songmae appeared remarkably tranquil. Old couples tended to their gardens, temple bells rang in the wind, children rode bicycles along pristine streets. But the architecture and habits felt slightly off. Every house was fitted with oversized windows projecting unusually bright lights and heavy, thick curtains. Young children were openly drinking coffee. The villagers were polite, but everyone carried heavy bags under their eyes, and no one spoke about tomorrow. At exactly 10:45 p.m., the quiet atmosphere shattered. Families scrambled into their homes, shops slammed their shutters, and public medicine was quickly distributed. A teenager who yawned was immediately struck by his terrified mother. Elder Mr. Han sat with Daniel. When asked about the sleep rumors, Han's polite demeanor vanished. He confirmed the 1:13 a.m. rule, warning that something in the mountains uses sleeping people. By midnight, the village mobilized for war against exhaustion. Loudspeakers crackled to life on street corners like an air raid system. Villagers sat outside their brightly lit homes, drinking ice water and heavily caffeinated drinks, forcing their bodies to stay conscious. Songmae operates differently than any other human settlement. Its entire civic infrastructure, from its architecture to its emergency protocols, is engineered solely to suppress a biological necessity. They are a community dedicating all their resources to fight the human circadian rhythm. At 1:12 a.m., the village warning system broadcasted a single repeating instruction: "Stay awake. It walks through dreams." 1 minute later, the temperature plummeted. The wind died completely. The ambient noise of insects and dogs vanished, leaving a heavy, pressurized silence over the entire mountain. The tension broke when a nearby, exhausted old woman let her eyes flutter shut. Despite the villagers throwing water and screaming her name, a wide, frozen smile stretched across her face. Still fully asleep, she slowly stood up. She began marching silently toward the mountain road. When dozens of villagers desperately tried to restrain her, the frail woman dragged grown men effortlessly through the dirt, displaying a physical strength that defied human muscle mass. She suddenly stopped and tilted her head toward Daniel. With her eyes still shut, a voice much deeper than her own slipped out of her smiling mouth. It whispered that it had found a foreign dream. Sleep in Songmae is heavily monitored because an individual lapse in consciousness instantly converts a vulnerable resident into a weaponized biological vessel. One person's exhaustion becomes an immediate physical threat to the entire community. Elder Han shoved Daniel inside a house and locked the doors, finally revealing the mountain's history. 50 years ago, locals realized an ancient intelligence was entering the minds of anyone who slept past 1:13 a.m. When the government sent a research team to investigate, the entire unit vanished overnight, and the official records of Songmae were quietly erased. This model illustrates the psychological intrusion. The mountain entity operates as a guilt parasite. It requires intense human grief or trauma to create an access point, allowing an external intelligence to bypass a sleeping person's natural psychological defenses and seize motor control. At 2:04 a.m., Daniel heard 3 slow knocks on his locked door. Then a soft, familiar voice drifted through the wood. It was his mother, a woman who had been dead for 12 years, asking him to open the door. The voice gently told Daniel that she forgave him. She had died in a car accident shortly after a bitter argument with him, leaving Daniel with a lifetime of unresolved grief. The intelligence outside was actively mining this specific memory to manipulate his reality. As Daniel reached out to turn the handle, Elder Han burst into the room holding a knife, screaming at him to never answer familiar voices. The knocking instantly stopped, replaced by the sound of something heavy slowly crawling across the roof above them. The parasite is so dangerous because it uses its victim's own emotional history against them. By relying on a person's deepest regrets to lure them out, the entity ensures that the threat feels entirely intimate and deeply self-inflicted. Around 2:33 a.m., the village's collective endurance broke. Multiple residents, exhausted beyond their physical limits, collapsed into sleep on the center road. Their eyes shut, smiles formed, and they stood motionless with their hands lifted toward the mountain. The cause of the breach materialized at the edge of the forest. A tall, impossibly thin humanoid shape stood completely still between the trees, its stark white eyes watching the chaos unfold in the streets. A nearby teenager collapsed, immediately stood back up with a frozen smile and pointed straight at Daniel, announcing that he dreams loudly. In complete synchronization, the entire crowd of sleepwalking villagers turned blindly toward Daniel and began walking calmly in his direction. Elder Han grabbed Daniel and they sprinted toward the only supposed safe zone, the local temple. They had to navigate a terrifying obstacle course, weaving through dozens of smiling neighbors who simply walked in silent pursuit. The villagers had maintained a fragile equilibrium for decades. Daniel's arrival introduced a skeptical outsider carrying fresh, deeply unresolved trauma, providing the entity with an incredibly rich psychological target that overloaded the community's defense systems. Inside the ancient temple, a monk explained that the entity is an intelligence that has fed on human fears for centuries. The temple's only defense is acoustic. The sharp, continuous ringing of handbells interrupts the specific brainwave frequencies the entity uses to anchor itself. Then, the temple lights failed. In the sudden darkness, the physical manifestation of Daniel's mother stepped into the doorway, wearing the exact clothes from the night she died. She called out to him, crying, as the sleeping villagers slowly filed into the room. Realizing his guilt was feeding the intrusion, Daniel lunged for the main rope. He violently rang the massive brass bell, sending deafening, chaotic sound waves echoing through the mountains, instantly collapsing the smiling villagers to the floor. Sunrise broke at 4:44 a.m., scattering the mountain figure back into the deep forest. Elder Han immediately drove the exhausted Daniel out of the valley before sunset. Back in America, Daniel found his videos corrupted, his files missing, and his channel repeatedly hacked whenever he tried to upload his story. The physical escape offered no actual safety. Every single night at exactly 1:13 a.m., Daniel's phone receives a 1-second voicemail from an unknown number. It's his mother's voice, whispering, "Still awake?" The infection is permanent, proving that once the entity maps your guilt, it doesn't need the mountain to find you.